Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks for having me today at your event. It's absolutely my pleasure. And so let me start by congratulating you all on what's been achieved through the work of OHDSI and certainly the work through Eden. And I'd like to follow up the presentations we've seen in the morning, how you bring data, how you standardize it and harmonize it, and how you then make networks and perform studies which ultimately inform care. So the first presentation today really struck a note with me by saying generating evidence, better decisions, better care. And that's certainly the angle the medicines regulators would take, where we look at improving the decision-making and ultimately benefiting patients as the last link in the chain of medicines regulation. So let's start with that then. I'm speaking today about real-world evidence, and it's a gateway to then talking about Darwin EU as the last topic of the session today. So just the usual disclaimers and the content on the data and the conflict of interest. And the vision of the medicines regulators, that means the EMA, the national authorities, is that by 2025, we would like to enable the use of real-world evidence and establish its value across a number of regulatory use cases, and I will come back to those. Now, the regulatory decision-making on medicines, obviously it's very quick slang, nearly quick technical lingo for us, any decisions we take on medicines, but always with the patients and the healthcare professionals in mind. So bringing medicines to patients faster, making sure their use is optimal, making sure they're safe and effective. And if any of those are not met, then making the decisions with the best evidence that there is. The other point I'd like to make here is that this is about enabling the use of real-world evidence, but that's to enable and to complement all the evidence we already have. So certainly not replacing randomized controlled trials, where those are the best standards of evidence, but rather to bring in the other evidence we could be using and optimize it. So how are we going to do that? There's, of course, several steps how we can achieve it, and you may have seen our publication from 2021. So there's, of course, access to data and to the evidence that can be generated, building and then optimizing the processes, standards, methods, knowledge, and I think I'm preaching to the converted. That's what you've been doing all along. Establish the value across the use cases. I will come back to that point. And, of course, international collaboration. So we will build on the work that's done via ICMRA, the Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities. And you may have seen the statement published last year. And hot off the press is the ICH reflection paper on real-world evidence that was published on Friday and is up for public consultation. So where we say real-world evidence and its use, it's not just that the regulators have the real-world evidence and obtain it. If we start at the top right panel, so medicines developers have been producing real-world evidence, pharmaceutical industry, medicines developers throughout their life cycle, and have to provide the evidence always with the submissions for medicines evaluation and supervision. We'll move bottom right. There are other sources of evidence, indeed, through academia, other researchers, communities such as OHDSI and Eden that are generated and then fed into the medicines regulatory decisions. Moving bottom left, NCAs, some of the national competent authorities also have access to sources of data from their territories, and they do obtain real-world evidence, which is certainly applied. And we're now closing the circle with the access to real-world evidence from the EMA, which is the point of my talk, and I'll take you through the three pathways how we can do that. So the use of real-world evidence is maybe a novelty in some areas, but certainly it's here. And it's not going anywhere. It's here to stay. I've got 3 reviews of the use of real-world evidence in the decisions on medicines from 3 different settings. And if you just focus on the orange box, 40% in the first paper, and then 100% in the middle, and 85% on the right of medicines applications have already contained real-world evidence. And this is mostly in oncology and anti-infectives. And, well, 100%, it can't go any higher than that. That means any decision that's taken is already informed. And in the left paper, we only looked at new applications, so that's 2 out of 5. So real-world evidence is certainly there. And the EMA's work on this domain, on bringing real-world evidence and optimizing its use and really support innovation and foster the improvements in public health, goes back a few years, and perhaps it goes back around the same time as we've seen the first paper of the morning session about the 34 data sources which were available and clustered and not harmonized. So the task force at the time looked at making recommendations how the big data can really be used effectively. And they've made their recommendations to a report. And this was then distilled into a work plan, which is now on its third installment. I think the presentation can be shared, so the links are live if you'd like to look at more details. So the first recommendation of the 10 points is the establishment of a network, which is a federated network that is Darwin EU, and indeed we will hear more about it throughout the last session today. There are other points which I will not cover for the sake of time, but they have to do with data quality, so establishing a data quality framework, data discoverability, so cataloging existing data sources, having an exhaustive list of metadata which can be mapping the diverse sources we've got across the continent, and then can be searched for the particular studies that are being performed. On the right-hand side, international collaboration, certainly we can't do it in silos. And then there's also an 11th recommendation added for veterinary medicine. So my focus will be human, but certainly the similar attributes are there. And then if we finish the segment on why, real-world data, real-world evidence for regulators. So as I said, it's certainly to inform regulatory decision-making, but this is to make the best decisions and then make sure the medicines use is optimal, they're safe, and used appropriately for the right patients and benefiting the patients and healthcare professionals. So where we would see the need for real-world data is where there are knowledge gaps, for example, subpopulations not studied, a need for more up-to-date data, or another sensitivity analysis, or corroborating the results in different populations, different databases. And we'd always have the criterion of being transparent and tailored and following the best practices. So we would look at trusted sources of real-world data, again coming back to its discoverability, data quality, and understanding what data can be used for what research purposes. But also tailor the research questions to where exactly the gap is. So we might have some evidence already, but it's perhaps not pertaining to the last 5 years in a disease area which has had rapid advances with the advent of new treatments. So we'd now like to know what's the current standard of treatment and are there further unmet medical needs. The evidence generation also needs to be timely, and timely, I think the pandemic has put very much the emphasis on this week rather than next month or in 3 months, and often the evidence is really required very quickly. Now in routine decision making, I think we have usual 2 months for many of the procedural clock stops. So if we can identify the needs either at the beginning of the time or slightly ahead, then we are working with the timelines of approximately 2 and 3 months, such that we can then inform the particular step in the product's life cycle with the decision, for example, on an extension of indication. And we want to look at, has this already been happening? Are patients treated, etc. And then lastly, the use of such federated analysis, as indeed Darwin EU is, can help us avoid some duplication and some inefficiencies. We can do one study using several sources and have the results obtained in that one step rather than have several players obtaining the same data or competing for the same data and producing partial results. So the regulatory use cases that I previously mentioned are very much across the product's life cycle. So some people would tell you real-world evidence is great for monitoring safety once the medicinal products are already on the market. And yes, I think this is fairly established. There's probably very little opposition to that statement. But we do see the applicability of real-world evidence across the product's life cycle. So if we start with the pre-authorization on the left, the codes, the 4 or 3 letter codes denote the committees of the EMA. So for example, decisions on orphan designation. If we have reliable data on the prevalence of the disease, we can facilitate that. The scientific advice and help with planning prospectively the development of a medicinal product. We can again look at the incidence of a disease in particular age groups, understand the comorbidities, and inform if the proposed trial would really be feasible, or if in 12 months' time we'd come to a situation when it's not recruited even half and therefore would struggle with its power. Further, supporting medicines development for children through the PDCO, and certainly any of the use cases I will mention on the next slides at the point of authorization or in the post-marketing supervision. So coming back to safety, but also the extensions of indications, studying new populations, and confirming effectiveness. So how we're doing that? The approach at the EMA is through 3 pathways, and I will present you each of the 3 in turn. So starting with the left side, the EMA has access to a number of healthcare databases which we can analyze in-house. So we do have licenses based on which we can access this data, and then we follow the usual governance, and we can obtain the analyses mostly from primary care use of medicines. And we've got access to 6 sources, and we're also working on some hospital data. Now, you will see on the next slides, we've done a review of the studies performed recently, and this is a major domain in the past few years, how we've done things. And in the middle, the EMA also has access to framework contracts, which are broad, high-level agreements with research institutions. And we have 8 such organizations contracted who have nearly 60 sources from 21 countries access to. And we can then rely on their expertise and also their sort of capacity to perform studies which come as individual orders under such a broad contract. On that note, these do tend to take much longer because of all the governance that needs to be in place, all the decisions and agreements. But then they are very flexible, and we can look at any sources, and I have an example to tell you for a rare disease. And then Darwin EU comes in early last year as a federated network, and we will be hearing about that very much for the rest of the session. So where we think the real-world evidence can come is in kind of 3 broad areas, how we've categorized them. So one is the planning and validity of studies. So this is upfront when we look at the design and the feasibility. So are there really as many patients in these countries as we intend to use for a proposed study? Or look at completed studies. Are the results representative? Is this in line with what's the targeted indication? Are we making in the application some broad statements about population that had not been studied at all? In the middle then, understanding the context. So what's the disease epidemiology? What's the natural outcomes? How is this managed? What's the first, second, third line? How are the outcomes depending on those? And how are particular medicines used? So we can talk about drug utilization studies to understand their use, and for example, off-label use, non-compliance with risk minimization measures, etc. And then on etiological studies, studies of associations, certainly safety studies, what people would probably understand as the traditional pharmacoepidemiological studies, but also studies of effectiveness and the studies of impact of regulatory decisions. Now, that's when things go as planned at the sort of routine times, but then public health crises happen ever so often, and certainly having such infrastructure, having availability of real-world evidence with short timelines and already understood data quality, which had been pre-assessed in place, will be very beneficial. And the last 2 years, 3 years nearly now, certainly showed us that. So what we can do in a crisis is monitor the use of medicines, for example, as they're being repurposed for treatment. Will there be any shortages? Will the gaps appear where these medicines had traditionally been used? For example, some of the immune therapies, anti-inflammatory therapies, which were repurposed during the COVID times. And for new diseases, understanding its natural history and outcomes will be invaluable. It will also help us contextualize in the development of vaccines and therapeutics, so understand the background rates of some adverse reactions, or adverse events rather. Help with repurposing, so if there are already data generated for patients treated with existing available treatments, we can look at some outcomes and help with the product development, and then certainly monitoring the safety and effectiveness of vaccines and therapeutics. So, I mentioned 3 pathways, and the experience to date has recently been looked at. We have published a report, I think about 10 days ago, and there's also a shortened info sheet, if you'd just like to read the highlights, to look at what are the real-world evidence needs of the regulatory network, what are the data sources requirements which are suitable, what are the methodological challenges, and then we also looked at the processes, how we obtain the research requests, how we then produce the studies, what are the timelines, and what are the opportunities for improvement. And this covered the last 18 months and coincides also with the first year of Darwin EU, which we wanted to include here in the review. And I've only got 3 slides to show you for the sake of time. So 61 studies in total, or rather research topics in total, and you see the majority, 49, were through the first of the 3 pathways, so in-house analysis at the EMA. And of those, 36 were feasible, the large proportion not feasible, which I will come to. And again, among the completed studies already by the time of the report, most of them in-house and 3 via Darwin EU. So the most interest, or rather the most demand for real-world evidence studies came from the PRAC, which is the EMA Safety Committee, so looking at medicine safety. And you'll see there were some non-feasible, but the majority vastly feasible, so probably studies of some outcomes or of use of medicines, and we will see it on the next slide. Then very closely in tow is the Pediatric Committee, so looking at the development of medicines for children and informing probably the decisions on the pediatric investigation plan. The Orphan Medicines Committee, Scientific Advice Working Party, and you will see again for the PDCO, the largest part, the light blue, are the studies that were not feasible. And when you sort of dissect that down, it's medicines in children, so it's already eliminating a large part of the population, often rare medicines in children, and looking at particular age groups. So the capture might just not be there in the databases due to the rarity, or indeed through the in-house databases we had included, which were mostly from primary care. So the type of analysis that these 61 requests included were mostly for safety, links back to the work of the PRAC, I think fairly established, no news there. Informing the design and feasibility of future studies. I'd imagine that's part of the PDCO, part of the scientific advice, and there you again see some of those which were not feasible. Understanding drug utilization, again, I'd expect that's routine work of the PRAC, and then clinical management of a disease and disease epidemiology. We don't have that many studies of the regulatory decisions impact, and certainly none in the representativeness and effectiveness, but I'd see that driven by the type of analysis with the in-house databases and the primary care databases. So that's where we will focus part of this, certainly with the study requests I'll show you at the end. And among those that were not feasible, so 19 studies out of 61, this was in the most part due to the exposure not being prescribed or authorized or captured, or not being marketed in the countries where we looked. So having the right sources for the right research questions, certainly one of the learnings. The outcome being rare or not recorded with the sufficient level of granularity are the rest of the reasons. And certainly the framework contract studies or the Darwin EU network are some of the ways how we can overcome these. So then to tell you one example of the framework contract studies, and I only have 2 slides on that. So for the framework contract studies, the process follows very much the regular process for any study, as you could imagine. So it starts with the request. We then prepare a sort of study overview, which we call technical specifications for the tendering procedure, which is a very lengthy procedure, but as we're a public body, we have to follow the financial rules, so we would have to tender it, and then we would go and consult on the research questions and invite the interested parties to tender. So once we've got the submissions, we would then evaluate the tender and come to a decision which of the framework contractors will be performing the study. So that process alone is 3 months just to get it started. But on the other hand, once we get selecting with the contractor from the framework contractors, we can move on with the study conduct, so the agreement on the protocol, contracting the data partners, and execution of the study up to a study report and the manuscript. So all in, we're looking anywhere upwards of a year, if not a year and a half. So it does take time, but you know, as Warren Buffett says, good things take time. You can't rush them. And this pathway also allows us to look at any of the sources which are readily available to the contractors or otherwise necessary. And the use case I'd like to tell you about is one which is currently being conducted, and it's a study on spinal muscular atrophy, which is a very rare disease and requires a specialist registry. So it's run in a consortium of registries, which is called TREAT, NMD, and with our contractor, who's Atian. The study would, of course, be made available through the UPass register, and I'll keep referring to that also in my last part of the studies. So you would find the protocol here and the report when the study is being finalized. So lastly, then, to introduce Darwin EU, which we'll hear more about. And Darwin EU is the agencies and the medicines regulators network of healthcare data sources, expertise, and services to support the decision-making with real-world evidence that's made from real-world data sources. And you may have seen this previously. The network as such is operated by the Coordination Center, whom we've got the representation here today. And I take this opportunity to thank Peter, Dani, Katja, Carlos, and the teams, the study investigators, certainly the data partners for your work on the establishment so far. The relationship with the data partners currently is done on a one-to-one basis based on contracts, so direct links. But in the future, we also expect to fully utilize the European health data space and the infrastructure that the legislation brings. The EMA, as the gateway point to the regulatory network, is the body that supervises overseas, but also guides the selection of the partners and orders the studies. Two more points to make, and I think I don't need to spend any time. If there's one room in the world who doesn't need to be told anymore about the common data model, it's probably this room. So the data stays local at the data partners, federated model, and the common data model allows everything that you've been probably working on the last 10 years. So, yeah. The current size of the network is the 10 data partners that are shown in color here. And it comes to a total of approximately 26 million active patients. There are a mix of sources that hold data from primary care, hospital care, specialist care, and on occasions having also registry data. We do also have one source that has primary, secondary, specialist care, and a biobank data. So that's number 7 from Estonia. And we're always looking for new data partners to be onboarded in the network. There was an open call earlier this year, which we are currently processing the results of, but it's always open. So if you'd like to apply for the network, then there's a link on the DarwinU website. There's more details and instructions. We also ask for the description of the metadata for cataloging the data source and to be able to make the decision. So again, huge thanks to all the data partners and huge thanks to the OHDSI and Eden for having made all those steps in the past that allow us to very quickly identify and pick data partners who already have the implemented common data model. So that's very much accelerated things massively. So the establishment of DarwinU was foreseen over 2 years. That's very much last year and this year. And I'm very happy to tell you that it's in progress and on target according to the plan. So it's a huge thanks to the Coordination Center and everyone else involved in the support with the subcontractors. We're focusing on growing the network and on study conduct. So I'll show you one more slide with the studies currently in progress to test as many of the use cases as possible. Because this also allows the preparation of the analytical pipelines and the analytical code. And when those are ready, they can be reused in the future, again, further shortening the timelines and optimizing the delivery. So the current year foresees 16 studies or so, with some flexibility in it, in how the split between the studies is done. And we should finish with 20 data partners at the end of this year, and then adding 10 every year until a total of 40. We're, of course, aware that there are many more than 40 across the continent who would be useful. So we're looking into ways if we can exceed that. And obviously, we'd love to have as many as possible so that at any research question, we could then draw on those who have the most relevant data and look at the countries, for example, where the medicine is used. Okay, so from the last year's 4 studies that were completed, there were one study of disease epidemiology on a number of rare blood cancers. The links in blue to EU pass registers are live. You can use the code and find them. All the study protocols, study reports are made public, so certainly nothing's hidden there. And you see in the middle column the number of data partners per study, so really leveraging the common data model and the federated analysis. We then have 2 studies of drug utilization in the middle, once on one product where there had been a particular safety concern and looking at more details on the use over time, incidence and prevalence, but also some other aspects, and we'll hear more about that study later. And then a drug utilization study from a public health perspective, looking at a large list of antibiotics over 10 years and in 6 data partners. Lastly, there's a complex study, so a study that has more attention in preparation of the protocol and its development on mortality in severe asthma, which again came from one of the decision-making we did on products in this area. So as I mentioned, everything's included in the EU pass register as soon as it's finalized. So this is the study protocol, or study report rather, and you'll see the section 9 with all the details on definitions and variables and data sources and methods. So certainly do have a look at it. You will also be more familiar in how the outputs of the analysis look. And just to note that there's also Shiny apps which allow the reader to swap the outputs in how they would like to read them. Right, and to conclude then, so a lot of work has been going on in the past, and in the past 18 months, and we're currently in the process of the studies for this year. So one study that's being finalized is the severe asthma study, and the protocol's already in the EU PASS register. The report will come shortly. Then we've got, if we go from top left clockwise, we've got a collaborative study of coagulopathy of COVID-19 infection and vaccination against COVID-19, and this is testing the implementation of the European health data space, so using a part of the study with the common data model in Darwin EU, but then also running it in parallel in national sources who are not using the common data model, and understanding how many of those can do all the objectives and how the data can be brought together. Then third, we've got the study of effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccines, and this study has a number of outcomes, including severe infection and some proxies of long COVID. This is in collaboration with the European Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, and it's EMA collaboration on the vaccine monitoring platform. And we're currently finalizing the scope and selection of the data partners for this study. We then have another use case from the authorization of medicines, and that's what we say the OTS stands for off the shelf, so one of the routine analytical pipelines that are already defined. Analysis on drug utilization of a combination of two substances for a particular disease. This time it's pulmonary hypertension, so to understand how often does this already happen in clinical practice. Bottom right, then we've got two use cases related to opioids. This, of course, is a global public health problem. So bottom right is the drug utilization study of a large list of prescription opioids. Again, looking at a number of European countries, looking at the duration of treatment, incidence of prescriptions, and things like that. And then the naloxone use case is in the use for reversal of opioid overdose. And this is, again, related to the decision-making we take on these substances. Last but one is a patient characterization study of the treatment patterns of patients with multiple myeloma, again looking at a period there over 10 years. And this is a study where pilot testing with collaborating with the HTAs and payers bodies. So once the medicines are authorized and supervised by regulators, there's additional steps at national level to decide on their reimbursement and their use. So trying to see where is the inner joint between regulators and HTAs and payers, and to understand what happens, for example, here, looking also at the survival. And last on the page is another which we got as a use case from what you would see as an old substance, erythromycin, an antibiotic, and in its supervision, a particular issue came up that it's used also for other indications, so to understand the scope of that. And we have other studies in the shortlist, which I can't present to you yet today because we're still working on them, but really you see that there's a lot of different scopes, so looking at disease epidemiology, drug utilization, effectiveness of vaccines, and various other use cases. So just to close, the use of real-world evidence for medicines regulation is being enabled, and as I spoke, we're testing the use cases as widely as we can, but the regulatory decision-making always with the patients in mind. So what will be the impact on the patients? Can we bring the medicines to them? Are they safe to use? Are they effective? And are they used optimally? We do have 3 pathways of real-world evidence generation. That's just inside the regulators. Of course, there are other pathways. And the current focus is on the growth of the Darwin EU network, further studies, piloting the use cases to test the pipelines. And this is something that's going to be really transformative for medicines regulation. The volume of studies rises dramatically next year to meet the demand, such that any step of the medicinal product lifecycle we can support if necessary, and also deliver them to an accelerated timetable, so to really deliver them within the procedures when necessary. And I can only conclude with thanking again the Coordination Center and the OHDSI community. So thank you to all of you.